That's the owner. What's the architect? Yeah, that's good.
So after our short break, we can continue now with an architectural dissection and viewpoint of Hazelhead and the time that Hazelhead was built. Peter?
When last I was here, I was rebuked by my niece Lily for not speaking into the microphone. She's a professional musician and knows about these things, and she told me, you should have done a sound check. I'm sure you'll yell at me if you can't hear me. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming out on a dreary night and a sad week. Especially thank you to Mr. and Mrs. Williams for the opportunity to visit their special house, and to Caroline, Doreen, and Elizabeth for forcing me to do this little show. My objective will be to locate Hazelhead in the history of Westmount, but also in the history of architecture. In other words, it's going to be a much more general talk than the one that Mr. Williams just gave. There's going to be, in some ways, it's a continuation to two recent presentations here, that by Toby Morant on the Native Peoples of Montreal, and also Alan Stewart on the Hercules House. So, first slide. This is the fortification plan of Montreal, part of it, prepared in they began work on it in 1868, showing Westmount. I've seen Tina Turner Turner and what she can do with a microphone. But showing Westmount, Côte Saint Antoine Road, Dorchester. What is now St. Catherine was then Dorchester. Dorchester continues into Montreal there. Is Green Avenue. You'll see that all of the land in 1870, more or less, virtually all of the land is farmland, which is the white, or orchards, which are the trees lined up, with a couple of areas which is still bush, uncultivated. The escarpment along here, which no one can plow, and the drainage area that goes into the glen. This is all the ravines that led into the glen in the old days, with the brickworks at the bottom. At the bottom right is St. Henri, and the tanneries. The railway there is the Grand Trunk Railway, and you can't see it, but it's written on there that that's Tannery Junction. Next slide. It's a photograph that we just saw of about the same time, Green Avenue. Next slide. This is the GOAT plan of 1890, by which time you see, this is after the house Hazelhead was constructed, but you'll see that Metcalfe Avenue is there. Sherbrooke Street is still not there. This is Côte Saint Antoine Road, Western Avenue, now de Maisonneuve, St. Catherine. Canadian Pacific Railway is there, but the Stone Bridge and road at the Glen has not been constructed yet, and they don't quite know what to do with St. Catherine Street here. It sort of disappears into the ravine. Next slide, please. This is the next city plan that we have, which is the Pensionnat plan of 1907. You'll see that by Metcalfe again, running down here, Western Sherbrooke Street is there, Côte Saint Antoine continues at the top. The land is pretty much divided into lots. You'll see that the old lots are much bigger than the new lots. The developers have taken a hold. And next slide. A detail. Again, you'll see the large lots of the areas held on Metcalfe. Next. Okay, that sort of puts the house in the history and how it fitted into the development of Westmount. Now, in a much more general sense, I'd like to talk about architecture and how the house fits into what got a little bit out of control and is a bit more architecture and history than I intended at the beginning. And I'll do that by talking about 6 different periods, 6 different years or eras in history, beginning with 1560. Next. Two things important to our story were happening around 1560. Here, somewhere between Montreal and Syracuse, in that big area, there was a guy called Hiawatha, who was a Huron, who was known for organizing the Confederacy of the Iroquois. He convinced them that they should stop fighting and killing each other. And next, and then at the same time, pretty much in the same year, in Vicenza, in what is now northern Italy, a guy called Palladio was working out what was then the most modern architecture that existed. Can I keep this forward? You will have seen this image a lot at Kahnawake in 1990. It's the Confederacy belt, the Hiawatha belt, the Great Belt of Peace, and it represents what Hiawatha did. Hiawatha was not an Ojibwa like Longfellow said, by the shores of Dixie Green. He was a Huron, and to call him an Ojibwa is sort of like calling Churchill, that great French statesman. But this represents the Confederacy of the Five Nations. The Five Nations are represented according Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, and Mohawk, combined by lines throughout, by each of the nations is joined. There's an unjoined end at each end, indicating that anybody else, any other group can join the Confederacy. All centered on the on Onondaga, where the Great Council Fire was held. It's the Great Tree of Peace. It's a white pine. White pines have 5 needles in a group, representing the 5 nations. And at the bottom of that tree was buried the tomahawks of war. Next. At the same time as that was happening, Palladio was working in Italy. This is a picture. He might have looked like this. This drawing was done 100 years after he died. But you can see that he's an architect. He looks worried. He's got his forehead is creased by the worries of early morning meetings with contractors and arguments with clients. But he was building houses, villas, in the vicinity of Vicenza at that time, like this one. These were working farmhouses. Major farms, evidently. But you'll notice that typically they're divided in 3 horizontally, 2 wings and a center bay with the door on the center axis, a portico or a temple front, pediment on top, and divided generally in 3 vertically. The lower floor being for the storage of wine, the middle for the people, and the top for the storage of grain. Next year, 1642, next. Again, 2 things are happening. Montreal gets founded with people from France, over to here, and Palladio's drawings moved to England. Next. Here's the Maisonneuve carrying the cross up to Mount Royal. A nice little drawing, another of many nice little drawings by C.W. Jeffries. That was actually 1643 in thanks for a receding flood in 1642. Next. Here we have another architect, this Inigo Jones, and a wonderful drawing by Van Dyck. Again, worried. Lots of arguments on site. Lots of fatigue. Look, in French they say les yeux d'un bave. But he's got nice long hair and a lot of buttons on his coat. And he was preparing drawings like this. This is a little earlier than 1640, but you'll see that a lot of it has been taken straight from Palladio. He had been to Italy early in the 17th century, and he bought all the drawings of Palladio that he could, and brought them to England, and studied them and worked on this. This is a design for Princess Lodging at Newmarket that was never built, but next. Okay. Next year, 1739. Okay, again, 2 things are happening on either side of the Atlantic. In Montreal, as we found out a month ago, the Hershey's house is being built according to traditional French models. In England, Palladio's drawings are published in his book, it's called the 4 books, the Quattro Libri, is republished in England, and then moved to all parts of the English-speaking world. Next. A little French farmhouse, north of France, probably 16th century. You know it's a farmhouse because there's a pig and chickens in the front yard. But a model that it would seem a little wrong in Quebec, but not that far from what you would expect. But it was the model for a whole series, for every important house in Quebec once they got past the stage of building things in wood. The objective was always to build in stone. This is the Manoir of Chalgoul near Montmorency, next. A Saint Scholastique, another Manoir. La Maison Capchi at Saint Antoine on the Richelieu. But the same model, by and large. We'll talk more about balconies later. The balconies and Belcast roof are not original. And then Hershey's house. Next. A photograph taken in the 1880s. It's clearly a farmhouse. It might have, and you would be hard pressed to prove that this photograph had not been taken in France in, say, 1890 or at the same time. Next. The front of the house. You've seen a lot of that. The thing about the French houses was that they were essentially rectangles. Okay, doesn't matter, one slide or the other. Because I scratched my head, you changed the slide, is that it? It's like an auction. The thing about the French, all of the French houses in Quebec was that they were essentially rectangular in plan, stone walls, rectangular, no partitions inside because the floors were held up by major heavy timber beams, and you could put the partitions, as Alan Stewart showed us, are just boards. They're 1-inch boards, not 3/4-inch boards like he said, but 1-inch boards, nailed wherever, I suppose, the farm wife said. Next. And then the roof is built of heavy timber according to a medieval carpenter's pattern. I mean, this sort of pattern, this sort of pattern is essentially the same as what held up the roofs of the cathedrals 800 years before. Next. At the same time in England, Lord Burlington, please allow me to introduce myself. I'm a man of wealth and taste. This is no architect. They look at his forehead. But he was moderately wealthy. He bought all the drawings that Jones had bought, all the Palladio drawings that Jones had acquired, and went to Italy and bought some more, became very enamored of the style, and had caused to be published in 1738, the year before Hercules, an English edition of Palladio's books. Next, please. He built himself this little, it's not a house, it's a Chiswick, and it's a little bit earlier. It's a little bit earlier than 1739. It's not a house, it's an addition. It's like a pavilion added to his father's house at Chiswick. But it established a style in the English-speaking world that went everywhere that Englishmen went. I guess this is that Robert Adam of Kettleston. I figured out a couple of years ago, that looking at the drawings of this house, I figured out that a fairly big house that I built 6 years ago would fit entirely in the entrance hall of this house. And I thought my house was pretty nice until I realized just how pitifully small it was. Next. This is William Chambers, the Dundas House at Edinburgh. But you'll see the same elements are continuing. 3 stories this way. This is in Edinburgh, so there's no rain on the top floor. But divided in 3 horizontally, a central panel with pilasters here, not columns, a pediment top. The elements are continuing the same, and they mark what is now becoming an English house, an English form of house. Next. Went to Ireland. This is a fairly big Irish house. These are all 18th century. Next. Became simplified. Late in the 18th century, it became the style to build a thing called the box house. It was very stylish. Still 3 stories, divided in 3 horizontally, although that pediment and the entry panel, the central panel in the front of the house, has been really reduced at this point. Next. And it also went to the United States. You'll see houses like this built of timber everywhere, following the same general pattern, but with very good pattern books for carpenters, published all during the 18th century. Next. Also in 1738, the year before Hercules was built or contracted, this guy, William Johnson, arrived in Albany, New York. Next. And here we come to 1800. Next. Several things are happening, or have happened at this point. In 1800, William Johnson moves from around Albany. No, William Johnson is dead by then. His son, John Johnson, moves from around Albany to Montreal. In England, a completely different style of architecture is beginning. I should say that, I should have said under the previous date, that Hiawatha's ideas and the Europeans, especially the Frenchmen, were very, very much impressed with the politics of the Iroquois. They were described at length in the relations of the Jesuits. They went to France. Those ideas became incorporated into the theory of the noble savage, Jacques Rousseau and those guys. In the middle of the 18th century, there were Americans like Franklin and Jefferson who spent a lot of time in Paris talking to philosophers. And Hiawatha's ideas, depending on your political view of native Canadians, either had a very great or lesser effect on the American development of the idea of democracy. Next. Here's John Johnson. Here's William Johnson. I'm sorry, I will get that straight. As I say, he arrived in Albany in 1738 to take over his uncle's property, stretching west from Albany, a property of, at that time, 81,000 acres. His uncle was seldom there. William Johnson parlayed that role into being the most important person in upstate New York for the next 20 or 30 years. My brother told me that he met a guy from Six Nations in Ontario who admired William Johnson a lot because he wore silk stockings inside his moose hide moccasins. I've always admired him because he bought his wife. He was walking out and saw a very beautiful girl within a couple of years of his arrival in North America. Asked about her, found out that she was an indentured servant. Now an indentured servant is the white equivalent of a slave. It's the same thing, except that you're white and not black, and that you have a promise of release after 16 or 20 years. However, she was for sale. He bought her, lived with her at Fort Johnson and in Johnson Hall, just west of Albany, until she died in her early 40s. Next. He built himself the Young Irishman on the Make in North America. Successful, built himself this house called Johnson Hall, according to the Irish model of Palladian English houses. I don't know how clearly you can see it, but it's a box house with a pedimented door, divided in three horizontally and vertically. Very simple plan, just a square plan and a simple roof. Next. William Johnson died in 1774, before the whole American Revolution resolved itself. His son followed the politics are complicated here, but in principle, he followed the English side of the American Revolution and moved eventually to Montreal. Next. Where he petitioned the British government for to be paid back for his losses in the American Revolution, and was extremely successful. He got a lot of money, enough money to buy the biggest house, fanciest house in Montreal at the time, which was the Intendant Biget's house, where Bon Secours Market now is. He bought the Seigneurie of Argenteuil, which is, and built this house at Saint-André-Est, which is up past Rigaud. He built a big house at Williamstown, Ontario. He built he bought two seigneuries along the Richelieu, that of de Manoir. You can pass a town called Saint-Angèle de Manoir, and a little bit further east, the seigneurie of de Renzy, and built this house, not quite on his seigneurial properties, but close by. This is near Chambly, and it's near Chambly at Saint Matthias, and this is another of the houses that John Johnson built. You see, following again, he built a house like his father had built at Alden. A simple stone box or brick box in the case of Saint-André-Est. Next. But at the same time in England, that Palladian classical model of architecture was no longer in favor. And people were starting to look at picturesque and romantic images of houses, not the simple classical, or the classical houses that had been the models for their fathers. They were looking at Gothic, they were looking at Chinese, they were looking at other examples to build from. This is an extreme example, perhaps. It's William Becker's house at Fonthill. You know, people are proud of their 12-foot ceilings in their houses. Some of the ceilings in this house were 120 feet. He had a clear view from that door down to the other end of the hall, 300 feet. Next. Sorry, go back. 1 minute. But you'll see that it's no longer a box. It doesn't have a classical pediment on it. The plan is complicated. It goes back and forth and bulges here and there. Next. Okay. Next day, 1850. By 1850, architecture, that Gothic model is starting to find its way into pattern books for country houses, and at the same time in Montreal, probably the last of the old English-Irish Palladian models is being built on top of Mount Royal. Next. Another Montreal merchant called Smith decides to build a house in the country on top of Mount Royal. He builds it just like John Johnson, like rich people had done. Next. The Smith house is just a big 55-foot square. It's almost square, and divided in three with a central corridor on all the floors, rooms on either side. Those bathrooms are not original. There were no bathrooms, no closets, not much heating in the house, some iron stoves and a couple of fireplaces next. But when Susan Bronson and I renovated or rebuilt and repaired that house a couple of years ago, that simple plan had no vestibule, and if it was going to be a public building, a vestibule was going to be required, and we built that little classical pediment thing, more or less in continuing that tradition. Next. But at the same time, you know, here was Smith building a very old-fashioned house in Montreal. At the same time, Andrew Jackson Downing was publishing drawings like this for country cottages and villas and farmhouses in a series of books that came out of New York. Here you'll see that the plan isn't square. There's bulges, there's bay windows. The roofs are no longer the simple roofs that we saw in the French and English houses, but there's lots of action going on in the roofs. There's a little bit of Gothic imagery in it. Next. houses were built in the 1840s, 50s, 60s, because English houses had balconies, and that beautiful bell-cast roof, that curve that goes down to cover the balconies of Quebec houses, was invented about that time. Early French houses had no balcony, virtually no roof overhang. Next. We're doing okay. Again, the plan is no longer rectangular or square, but follows the important rooms of the plan to be see more or less. It's nice to have a wood room and a dairy in your house. Next. Upstairs you'll see something that hasn't existed, that didn't exist in French houses or in English houses, and that is the closet. There's a closet here, closet there for the bedroom. A new invention, very convenient, but not seen in those earlier models of houses. Next. 1872, the year of the Williams House. Next. Information continues to come out of New York, mostly New York, a little bit Boston. England has been left behind now. The four country houses, such as the Williams House, the models come from New York. At this point, they come from a book called Woodward's. National Architect was the book published in 1869. One of the first after the Civil War, which stopped everything in the States and brought some money to Montreal. Next. Continuation of some of the ideas we saw in Downing, porches, a plan that bulges and sticks out here and there according to the rooms and windows that you want. Bay windows, fancy roofs, lots of different roof slopes. Next. And in plan, again, in many ways, it's not the same as the Williams House, but all the elements are there. Next. Closets, no bathroom. I'll come to that. Next. And there we have all the elements of that 1850, 1870 style of house. Next. The plan, this is a rough plan of the Williams House. The entry that Mr. Williams talked about, what I think was originally a dining room, a double parlor, a service wing at the back, which is kitchen basically, and something you saw that you didn't see in the news for French houses, a service wing. There's 2 stairs in the house at this time. Next. And the upstairs with a series of bedrooms. There are 2 bathrooms here which were probably built in the 30s, I would say. I'm not sure exactly how the house worked at that point. It doesn't matter, but you see they have closets, but didn't have a bathroom at the time. Next. I visited the house with a Westmount mechanical engineer called Seymour Levine, very knowledgeable man, and we talked about how the house was probably heated at that time. Our guess is that it was heated by hot air. Hot water, the radiator and pipe system that exists now, was not generally used for residential heating until the 1890s, whereas this sort of furnace, a hot air furnace with a coal or wood burning fire chamber surrounded by ducted air, was very common. We could have been more certain about that. I actually brought my crowbar and my 6-pound hammer, but Mr. Williams would not allow me to make the holes that would have verified this. Next. Very commonly in the specifications of that time, you'll see that the plumber is required under his contract to make a connection to the humidification system of the house, which is very simple. A drawing which could have been done in 1870, showing a ball cock, like a toilet tank is the word, with a ball cock in it supplying water to essentially a little pen in the path of the hot water going through the furnace, thereby humidifying the house. It took them a long time to get back to that feature after hot water was installed, hot water heating was commonly installed next. There was the question or Mr. Williams talked about the outhouse, the privy that originally existed at his house. And I must say that looking at the books, in 1850s, 60s, and 70s, the idea of a bathroom was not really clear to any of the architects working on houses. And so that even here in one of the houses from Woodward, you'll see that there are two water closets, but you can't get to them from inside the house. You've got to go out on the porch, which you see a couple of times in Downing, and very commonly for another 10 years after that. Some of the houses are starting to have bathrooms, but very often there will be a bathroom with a bath in it on the second floor, but the WC will be not in the house, in the backyard, or outside access only, as here. Next. Some years ago, this sort of fits in with the bathroom toilet question. Some years ago, I worked with the Crees at James Bay at a town called Nemisco. This is pretty much a complete view of the town of Nemisco from Champion Lake. Next. And I was there talking to them about the construction of permanent housing. This was at that time their permanent housing. And we had long discussions, mostly through interpreters. But one of the old hunters said to me, when we were talking about houses, he said, "It's never going to seem right to me to shit in the house." Next. Now, at the same time, that was 15 years ago. At the same time as Mr. Williams' house was being built, Lord Beaumont was building this house in England. Everything that you see there was built in 1873, even though it's really a renovation project that got a little out of control. But in 1873-74, this house had no bathroom. There was not one bathroom in this house. Next. And you can sort of imagine if it was for sale in the Westmount Examiner, the listing, elegant reception rooms, 28 bedrooms, facilities for live-in staff of 52, no microwave, no bathroom. But Lord Beaumont did install a bathroom by 1880. Next. And now we're back to Metcalfe Avenue. But the last point I want to make is that this model of house with the irregular plan, the porch, the bay windows, the fancy roofs, is that it's still very much a model for what we consider to be good, not country houses now, but suburban houses. And there's a couple of examples from, those books in the magazine store that have 101 plans, house plans. You can buy the blueprints for this house for $395. Next, please. And they're pretty much of the same model. They got roofs, they got balconies, they got bay windows. Next. Next. And you recognize all the parts of these houses. Even colorful flowers in the garden. Next. Just one last thought here. That sort of brings the architecture of that sort of country house, and we've been talking about country houses here, not urban houses, up to the present, that the style that originated 150 years ago is still the style for suburban houses. At the same time, even though Hiawatha's ideas went to France and then came back to the States, not all of his lessons were learned. As we're seeing this week. Next. And next. And I would think that we should have learned from Hiawatha the idea of confederacy, the idea of cooperation, the idea of peace, and all those bloody tomahawk missiles should have been buried under the great tree of peace. Thank you.
We do have time, about 15 minutes, if you would like to ask either of our speakers a question or make comments about the house that we have been talking about. Mr. Williams, maybe you'd like to stand up here so that... Okay, do we have any comments or questions? Yes?
Mr. Williams, the house as it exists at the moment, can you hear me? Yes. The house as it exists at the moment is quite different from the picture that we have of a gingerbread house with fluted columns and all the gingerbread and stuff that existed when the house was just built. Have you ever considered a bit more of the restoration side of things on the house instead of the garden?
It's so easy to spend other people's money.
I've given up on mine, so it's something.
It would be nice, but anything decent would cost some hundreds of thousands of dollars, I suspect.
Well, no, you've got a son who's very good at this.
Yes.
I'd like to know whether you feel, Mr. Lyson, that the house would pass the Westmount Architectural Commission today.
Structurally, I believe it would, yeah.
Solid masonry?
Yeah, I believe. No, almost certainly, yeah.
Can I interrupt for a minute? What kind of conditions were you thinking of?
Well,
What
I
stage
was
of the house?
thinking in terms of if a plan such as that was presented today, whether it would be approved. And they're so, well,
I understand. You never can tell. Sometimes it becomes personal, it becomes a matter of personal taste. But it should be okay. It should be, because it's still in that style which it did a lot to establish in Westmount. Being the progenitor, it's still like a lot of its children, so it should be okay.
Yes.
Mr. Williams, you showed one sample of wallpaper in a closet upstairs. Was that a typical pattern used in the house? And because I understand that Victorian houses had wallpaper to distinguish them from barns that had white walls. Didn't want to confuse them.
It's the only bit of wallpaper in the house. And that's been there since we moved in, so that's really all I know about it.
So we assume that it was not wallpapered. The house was not wallpapered. Didn't have wallpaper.
Probably won't fit.
I think
interject on that and ask people here, how many of you have painted over the old wallpaper in your old house so that the plaster doesn't come off?
I have. Yeah, and all that.
Well, quite a few people have used that solution, because if you try and take off some of that old wallpaper, it's very difficult to get it off. And then the plaster comes and you end up re-plasterboard and doing the whole thing. Whereas if you have a house where that paper is stuck on very well, I know a lot of people use that option.
Well, sometimes that wallpaper is quite heavy paper too. And sometimes even the plaster underneath is like a rough plaster.
Yes? Someone else?
Peter, I'm very interested. The house was built in 1870, we said? 1872, 3. And when was the pull chain toilet invented? The flushable toilet, because that was a very, very important part.
The toilet predates that when Longshot was invented about 1830.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Toilets, flushing toilets were not uncommon in the 1830s. And they existed. You could buy them.
Okay, so this was then planned as a country house with an outhouse.
That's right.
In other words, it was not sort of considered to be a part of, I'm not sure.
Water, I mean, there was well with it.
Yeah, I do know that in the plans that I've seen for Westmount in 1874, when they show the subdivisions of property and so on, you begin to get the idea that they were going to be introducing sewage systems fairly early in Westmount's history.
Which they could not do until the drain was installed down the glen.
Right.
They had nowhere to go. And we know that was 1890.
Yeah, because we had a recession in 1875, and all the plans for Westmount were put on hold for 20 years. And then suddenly, 1895, all hell broke loose, and so on. But this house would either have to have a septic system or an outhouse. And until then,
That would have been regarded as quite a normal thing in those days.
Yeah.
When they did, before they started building the extension of the Palais Congrès, they had to, according to law, bring in the archaeologists who did excavations and where they were going to build a parking along St. Antoine Street. I saw the drawings and I saw some of the holes they dug at that time. And it was row housing along St. Antoine Street. Every 22, 24 feet there was another building. In every backyard there was a privy and a well. That's real scary to have, your well at most 20 feet, 15 feet away from the ship.
yeah.
But then, but I'm not sure what they used the water from the wells for, because I know that well into the 19th century, water was delivered around Montreal by truck, by tankers, tanker wagon. And you could buy water at the site. And I'm not sure how much water, I really don't know how much water people drank in the 19th century either.
But I mean, for Metcalf Avenue in 1870, they must have had their own well.
Yeah, oh yeah, oh yes,
I mean, we have streams coming down off the mountain,
oh yeah,
right there.
yeah. Oh, there was water there.
The well was probably in that little barn in the back with a hand pump.
Yeah.
It's enclosed.
Yeah.
That would be my guess.
The other thing I'm wondering is, would the furnace have also served as the stove?
No, the furnace was in the basement. If it was, as I believe, a hot air system, it was in the basement. The stove would have been in the kitchen, an iron stove, as Mr.
Well, a
Williams
lot
said.
of kitchens were in the basement back then.
Not this day. I don't know. It wasn't a fancy enough house. I would say.
Can we have one more question?
or comment?
An
Yes,
observation.
again.
You said the original owner died of typhoid.
Yeah.
Perhaps his well was contaminated.
Mayor, we are both of you for coming, and Carolyn, would like to thank you officially from the WHA, and we have a gift for you.
I think we've made a very big journey this evening from microcosm of the Williams home with all the loving detail about the lovely, simple home and the obviously very loved garden. And the macrocosm of the history of the country house from Palladio until now, in effect. And both of the talks have shown us a lot of love for the subject. I think coming from different places, but I think we all know that home is where the heart is, and both of these guys have their heart in the right place.
Thank you.
These are our traditional WHA gifts. Huntington Bay's wonderful book, A View of Their Own, the story of Westmount, and our two